Hi, this is Mrs. Jacobson. Today we'll be covering Biodiversity and Evolution from Chapter 4 in our textbook. Remember, you need to be taking notes throughout the video, and also you want to be writing down the answers to the questions as they come up. In this particular lecture, the questions are called quick thinks, but again, you're writing the answers on a separate sheet of paper. All right, biodiversity and evolution comes up quite a bit throughout our text. Biodiversity is one of the main factors in sustainability. It comes up, like we just mentioned, in Chapter 4, looking at living things, in Chapter 7 at species interactions, Chapter 8 for population dynamics. We'll see it in Chapter 10, sustaining biodiversity, and specifically how we do that from an ecosystem level, and also in Chapter 11, looking at species. So we'll be diving into all of these chapters in the coming weeks. As I do with most of the lectures, we're going to explore Chapter 4 looking at different big ideas. So the first big idea is that biodiversity is essential to life. So we'll look at it on a bunch of different levels. Specifically, we'll look at biodiversity amongst genes, across organisms, and then also across different ecosystems. And we looked at this already when we compared terrestrial ecosystems, noticing that in hot and dry climates like this desert here, we had a bunch of different, a diversity of different organisms that live there, like cacti and lizards, for example, compared to the tundra, where we have really short-growing mosses and lichens, and large mammals that have lots of fur and fat. So again, we'll be exploring that biodiversity is essential to all life on the planet, and in order for life to be sustainable, we need to have this variety or biodiversity. So what is biodiversity here? The biodiversity is the total variety of Earth's species, their genetic code, and the places that they live. So we can look at biodiversity from a species perspective, and you can see here we've got different species of raccoon, of snails, of slugs, of birds, right? And then within those species, we can look at genetic diversity. So how are these different raccoons different genetically? How are the snails different? How are the slugs different within each species? And then on a larger scale, we looked at biodiversity of biomes or ecosystems. So there's things like the desert versus tropical rainforest, and there's a lot of diversity there, obviously, between a desert and a rainforest, or the tundra or the taiga. Okay, so first starting with species diversity here, we have things from the smallest of snakes. You can see the snake up here is about as big as a quarter, all right, and down here to these little bitty seahorses, really tiny. How many living things are there out in the world? It's estimated that there's somewhere between 4 million and 100 million different species on our planet. We've only classified about 1.8 million so far, but every year we get new species, so thousands of new species are identified. We talked a little bit about this about a month ago when we were looking at our slides. Where are we finding new species? And we had a current event presentation that within 20 minutes of being in tropical rainforest, a scientist was able to identify a new species. We've seen even new species come up in the last few years that are pretty fun to look at, like this bug-eating sea slug up here. This little sea slug is its own new species. We didn't know that such a thing existed. Most sea slugs eat things like algae and things like that. Some might even eat eggs. But this particular sea slug actually does indeed eat insects. And then we've got things like this pitcher plant. You might have seen these. Their leaves are adapted to secrete a digestive enzyme, and they can live way up in trees or way down at the base, often in tropical and subtropical areas. But they secrete this enzyme, and then they draw insects in there and then quickly digest them and use them for nutrients instead of having to get nutrients out of the soil. Pretty cool adaptation there. And then there are other things like these frogfish that also live in subtropical waters. And you can't even tell that's a fish, but indeed it is. You can see its little eyes right here. And this guy mimics other things in the reef areas. It is indeed a fish, and it eats other fish. It doesn't move much, but pretty cool coloration. And there's a lot of diversity within the frogfish. They don't really look much alike. So one might look like this guy here that's blending in to the base there of the reef, and others might look like anemones or coral of some sort, or some even mimic green algae. The only way to really tell that these are indeed frogfish is to look at their genetics and to compare their genetics to other frogfish genetics, not by looking at their phenotypes or the characteristics that you can see. Pretty awesome that we have these three. These are kind of the most unusual ones that I could find, new species that we've discovered. There are others as well. Here are some new species that were just discovered in 2011. There's the Bonaire banded box jelly. It's pretty awesome looking. The sneezing monkey or snub-nosed monkey. SpongeBob SquarePants mushroom, one of my favorites. You can tell down here if you look at these guys, the mushroom itself looks a little bit like SpongeBob, I'm sure named after the cartoon character. And the dive-bombing parasitic wasp. All of these different species were indeed discovered in just a couple years ago. Again, thousands of species discovered each year. We really have no idea how many different things are out there. Okay, so we've seen species diversity, the fact that there are many different species on our planet. To what extent, we don't really know as we're discovering new species every year. And then there's also genetic diversity, and this is differences in genes of the same species. So we have differences of genes of the same species, and that means that we have some lizards of the same species looking orange and others looking black and yellow. Luckily for this species of lizard, the ones looking black and yellow are able to blend into an environment that's very different from the ones looking orange. So if the environment drastically changes, you have a lot of variability within this species to survive those changes. And we know that Earth is very dynamic and it's going to change, so having more of this genetic diversity is going to be favorable for this particular species of lizard. The same is true of all species on the planet. The more genetic variability they have, the greater the chance for them to survive Earth's changes. So imagine here, if this top of this bottle here is all the variation in the different cheetahs. We've got blue and green and purple and yellow and orange and red cheetahs, and let's say all those different colors represent the different genetics of the cheetahs. So some have the blue, let's say the green, the light blue, and the turquoise. These ones down here have the genetic ability to fend off a certain disease, right? And that disease comes through this cheetah population. Well, then the ones without that genetic variation, without that possibility, those without that genetic variation don't make it through what's called this population bottleneck. So the bottleneck is a result of whatever the cause of this disease is, but those that are immune to it are able to survive, and those that are not end up dying off. You still have cheetahs around because they have the variation within their species, just not the ones without that particular trait, that genetic characteristic. And then we've talked about this one, ecosystem diversity. So biomes are home to many different unique species. We know here that polar bears in the tundra are not going to be able to survive in a place like the savanna that's more appropriate for things like rhinoceros and giraffes. And the chaparral here is home to the roadrunner, where the roadrunner we know couldn't survive here in the tundra or up here in the savanna. So because of our ecosystem diversity, we're able to support a much greater number of species and a much greater number of the genetics within that species. So maybe a certain polar bear here is only able to live in tundra regions, certain tundra regions. And the same might be true of certain roadrunners. But other genetic variations within the roadrunner might be able to live in a greater variety of chaparrals, okay? And it just depends on their niche. And we'll talk a little bit about niches of species a little bit later. But we're happy that we have so much ecosystem diversity here, and we're able to see all the funny, quirky things that we're able to see across the planet in these different biomes. So why is diversity important? Why are we studying this? Well, Without the diversity across our planet, we wouldn't have all the varieties of food, of wood products, fibers, energy, medicines, nutrients, all these things listed here. In fact, without the amount of diversity we have on the planet, we wouldn't have fertile soil and certainly not even the ability to dispose of our waste because of all the diversity within bacteria. Okay, and here are just a few more local ones, like the foxglove, Digitalis purpurea. It supplies us with a heart medication. And each of these has its own importance. Well, plus, with a lot of diversity, we get a lot of funny looking creatures, plants, and animals, and it makes life a little more beautiful, I think. For this lecture, I'm calling the questions you need to answer on a separate sheet of paper quick thinks. The first question is, thinking about the different types of biodiversity, from genetic biodiversity to species biodiversity and then ecosystem biodiversity, what might be some other reason protecting biodiversity is important? So for this, I'd like you to generate a list of a couple of different reasons. So I'll give you an example using salmon. So one moral or ethical reason to protect salmon is that all animals have a right to be here because they can think and feel and have a nervous system. One social or political reason might be that Native Americans have been fishing for salmon for thousands of years and it's part of their cultural tradition. One economic or business reason is salmon fisheries provide a lot of money and jobs for our economy. And then one personal reason is I personally love to eat salmon. So all reasons to protect salmon and the diversity of different salmon species in the Northwest. I'd like you to create a list of your own reasons for protecting biodiversity, and you don't need to use just one species like I did with salmon or one organism. You can use lots of different examples if you like. All right, big idea number 2. Evolution explains how life has changed over time. If you look in your book at the beginning of chapter 4, it talks about how life has changed through the last 4.7 billion years, starting with chemical evolution, the first billion years, and moving into biological evolution, the last 3.7 billion years. Life has changed dramatically. Okay? So evolution is our reasoning for how things have changed over time. From the first fossil records of animals, where we see very simple organisms leading up to insects and amphibians moving on to land, reptiles, and then mammals, and finally we get the very last little bit here of our time frame, we see humans. We're going to be looking at geological time frame on Monday of this week, and we'll see just how short of a time humans have actually been on this planet. It's pretty remarkable to think about. In fact, it's probably out of most of our realms to think how much longer some of these simple organisms have been here than we have. Okay, so the unrefuted scientific explanation for how things have changed over time, populations in particular, has to do with evolution. Evolution occurs when the genetic makeup of a population changes. Okay, pretty simple. We look at these guys up here, right? We'll call these some kind of crazy fly up here, and they're sprayed with a particular pesticide. Now, only a few of these flies here have a resistance for that pesticide. So those flies are able to survive here and reproduce. So we call those fit flies, right? They have this special pesticide, or special pesticide resistance in them. So these ones down here don't make it because of the pesticide, and these survive. So those that survived have this pesticide resistance, they reproduce, and all of their offspring here also have the pesticide resistance. So the genetic makeup of this population has dramatically changed from a mixture of those with the pesticide resistance and those without to only pesticide-resistant flies here in the remaining population. The same can be said here about this bird predator only being able to see the beetles that don't have the brown gene, so they're green here. So of course this bird comes up and eats what it sees. It doesn't see these brown insects or brown beetles here, and the result is an increase in the frequency of brown beetles. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? This is simple evolution here. Notice evolution occurs on a population level. It's not predetermined. These green insects aren't like, darn, I wish I wouldn't have chosen to be a green insect. It's just simply their genetic makeup. The phenotype is this display of this green coloring. It's not a choice that they made or a bad adaptation. It's just simply what they were born with. Like you or I being born with a certain hair color or eye color. We can't change that. We can't predetermine it. Well, unless we put in fake eye color or hair color. But by and large, in the animal population, there's no changing the genetic makeup and the phenotype display of that. So a quick history here, the concept of evolution, that life changes over time and that there must be some type of common ancestors between certain species. This began a long time ago with the Greek philosophers. I put Aristotle and Plato up there for you. And this has been a common idea. The idea of evolution has also kind of evolved over time to what we have now. For some reason, you can't see this particular pictures over here, but it was not until Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace did anyone come up with a credible explanation for evolution. And what they found is natural selection in a nutshell. You see these birds here, yum, green beetles, our favorite. And over time, only the red beetles survived. What was not common, and you can't see, I wish you could, was this idea that giraffes, their necks grew to reach the higher branches, and that because their necks were able to grow, those are the ones that survived. That really didn't hold up with credibility, that there was some type of predetermination within a species. So how did we get to this idea of natural evolution by natural selection? First, there was this observation that there's a struggle for existence. There is always a struggle to stay alive. Okay? Next, they observed that those with the best traits survived and lived long enough to reproduce. So there was a variety of traits, and those with the best or most adaptive traits to that particular environment lived long enough to reproduce and have offspring that could also reproduce with those particular genetic traits that are favorable to their environment. Boom, so they put it together. Natural selection. Some individuals in a population have traits that make them more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass those particular traits on to the next generation. Over time, the population changes so that most of them have those traits. We see here the white moths do not blend in with the darker bark color, and so they are eaten and are unable to pass those white moth genetics on to the next generation. Whereas these brown moths in this particular tree are able to blend in and pass those brown moth genetics onto their offspring, which then will be brown moths and pass those on to their offspring. So eventually you end up with more brown moths. It really depends on the environment. In this particular tree environment, notice the white moths blend in better, and so the brown moths are eaten. The trait that's most favorable in this condition is the white moths, and those are the ones that are going to survive and pass those particular favored traits on to the next generation. So in this case, the brown moths are more fit, but in this case, the white moths are more fit. When we talk about fitness, remember, we're not talking about how fast or far those moths can fly. We're talking about the ability to pass their traits on and reproduce. So over time, this idea of natural evolution by natural selection has grown. More and more evidence has been produced to support this idea, and it's been elevated to the status of a theory. We know that theories have to be our hypothesis that gets supported over and over and over again in the research that we do. And over time, as they continue to be supported, they get elevated to become a theory. Okay? So, however, natural selection is not the only way populations evolve. And if we look up here, we've got the gray wolf here, and all modern domestic dogs are essentially a descendant of the gray wolf. So how do we end up with all these different breeds of dogs? Is it because of natural selection? Well, not so much. It's actually a result of human selection, humans breeding dogs for specific traits, like I want a cuddly dog, or a dog to look a certain way, or a dog to herd my cattle, or to chase birds, or whatever the case may be. In that instance, the dogs themselves were not selected for by natural processes, one might say, but instead by human processes. So the theory of evolution has been expanded upon and refined over time, and it's eventually led to what we call the modern synthesis, which is kind of came about in the late 1940s, 1950s, but based on all the evidence we had for evolution, they kind of pooled together from biologists of different varieties. So biologists looking at evolution, biologists looking at the way genes have changed versus populations, and things like this. And all the scientists came together representing these different fields and contributed to this idea of modern synthesis. Julian Huxley was really the first to invent this term, but it's also been called other things such as new synthesis, evolutionary synthesis, things like that. And that's now what we kind of coined the term modern synthesis instead of natural selection. So just a quick background there. All right, so how do populations change over time? Remember, evolution happens on a population level, not on an individual level. But on an individual level here, you have what's called genetic mutations. So two animals, could be humans, come together through sexual reproduction and produce a new offspring, right? So part of the reason why you look like your parents is this combination of genetics, right? And every now and then there's something that changes the genetics. There's the chromosomes within your genetics are mutated a little bit. There's a little change. Most of the time, those chromosomes, if mutated at all, cause death. There's just no way that that offspring can survive, and they're usually not born. However, on rare occasions, these genetic mutations come out in different traits, such as this cat here has these a funky genetic marker that enabled them to be born with many different toes compared to a typical cat, or this frog here that survived despite being born with some extra limbs there. On a rare occasion, these specific weird genetic combinations where you end up with this mutation can be a beneficial mutation, in which case this cat might be able to survive better than a cat with only the typical number of toes. In that case, that beneficial mutation allows that cat to survive better and have offspring with that same mutation that also can survive better. So natural selection occurs with differential survival and reproductive success of individuals in a population. So we've talked about this kind of at length, but this gray wolf here with extra warm fur would be able to survive better than a gray wolf without that extra fur. And as a result of being able to survive more, they're able to have more offspring, and their offspring would then, because that's a genetic trait, also get warmer fur. A group here of bacteria, including genetic resistant ones, are exposed to an antibiotic. Most of the normal red bacteria here die off, but those resistant bacteria with this mutation here start multiplying, and eventually the population has a resistance to that particular antibiotic. Sometimes you have what's called coevolution, in which you have this antibiotic, right? And at first it starts to kill off this normal bacteria. There's a mutation in which the genetically resistant bacteria then form, and we have to come up with a new antibiotic that these particular resistant bacteria do not have the resistance for. And so it's called coevolution because we evolve a new antibiotic and they evolve a new resistance to it, and it goes back and forth. Some people call it an evolutionary arms race. Quick summary: genes mutate, right? There's some type of genetic mutation. Individuals are selected for because they're able to be fitter with that particular mutation. It's a beneficial mutation, and populations evolve that are better suited to their particular environment. So you end up with birds here in different environments that are selected for to get whatever food they need with their particular beak shape. All right? And those with the best beneficial beak shape are those that survive. These might be birds that were once of the same species, but eventually over time their beaks have evolved within that particular species, and you get what's called speciation. So this species becomes different than that species of bird, and we'll talk more about that later. All right, we're through with the next big idea, and let's go on to our next quick think question. So how does natural selection tie in with biodiversity? I want you to create a graphic that helps answer the question. It can be a concept map or a Venn diagram here, but you need to represent it on your separate sheet of paper, that graphic, and you can even write a little bit to explain what this graphic means to you. So this seems like quite the awesome deal that, we've got this natural selection so we can adapt to a changing environment over time, and allows this whole biodiversity of species to continue to exist. Unfortunately, natural selection has limits. First, the environment is constantly changing. So what is best fit now may not be for long, and populations have to adapt or leave, migrate, or die. In this case, we have polar bears here. In the not too distant past, polar bears were selected for how well they could hunt their prey. Now, these polar bears might have been fantastic at hunting their prey, but unfortunately now we have less of the polar ice caps, and as a result, polar bears are being more and more selected for how long they can hold their breath and swim to the different structures of ice. And so in this case, these polar bears are like, oh no, I can hunt really well, but I maybe cannot swim and hold my breath as long as I need to. So they must be able to adapt over generations, or they have to migrate, leave, or unfortunately they become extinct or die. So populations can only adapt with traits that they already have. They can't just somehow spontaneously make up a new trait to deal with certain conditions. For example, humans just couldn't spontaneously have a specific trait to allow us to deal with all the pollution in the air. Unless a mutation arises that gives us greater ability, it has to be present in our gene pool already. Many species reproduce slower than the environment changes, and we can't adapt fast enough. For instance, for humans, if we even got a mutation to deal with pollution, in order to be able to pass that trait along, many humans would have to die off or not be fertile in order to get that mutation passed along fast enough. So many species reproduce slower than the environment changes, and if you can't adapt fast enough within your population, you are going to go extinct, and hence there's the population bottleneck, which is next week's current event. Question is, will humans make it through our own population bottleneck in regards to pollution, to limited food resources, to water availability? All those things are going to limit our population survival. Okay, that was a pretty quick movement from one quick think to the next. But the question here is, explain why genetic diversity is so important to the health of a population. Develop a fictional case study that illustrates the answer. So in this case, if a population of frogs lacked genetic diversity, then what would happen? So if this frog, for example, and this frog had the exact same genetics and a certain parasite, or you decide on this fictional case came through, maybe both of these frogs would die. It's up to you. I want you to develop a case study that illustrates your understanding of why genetic diversity is so important. Okay, big idea number 3. Geological processes have changed the earth and created opportunities for the evolution of species. So, when we talk about geologic processes, we're talking about volcanoes, earthquakes, plates moving away here. Look at this poor guy. Come on, Rex, you can do it. Jump, boy, jump. Hurry, Rex, jump. And he's afraid he's losing his best friend there. And we'll look at this image here in the next slide. So we know the lithosphere is composed of plates that make up the Earth's crust, and over time they've been moving around slowly over the Earth's liquid mantle. You can kind of think of it as icebergs floating on water. We have these large continents and plates kind of floating also, or moving slowly on the Earth's liquid mantle. So why does this matter in terms of in terms of biodiversity? The impacts of plate tectonics, obviously They've changed where land is and thus the climate of those particular areas. Moving plates help species move into new areas, or they can also separate them and you get what's called speciation. Okay, so here we see possums looking one way, and here we see them looking totally different because they've moved from one area to a different area, and over time they've adapted and evolved in that particular area different traits. Four major impacts of these geologic processes. Earthquakes create fissures, mountains, and they separate species. Volcanoes wipe out existing species. They make way for new ones to fill in those specific niches. Climate change has been happening on our planet since it existed. We've gone from ice ages to periods of warming, and some species go extinct, whereas others do really well depending on what's happening in their particular adaptations. Catastrophes wipe out species and whole ecosystems. We've seen that more recently with massive tsunamis or typhoons. And we saw that in the not so distant past with the dinosaurs. We can see here when we talk about plate tectonics, there are a lot of different things happening. We've transformed plate boundaries here where the moving of plates along each other create earthquakes. We have here plates diverging from each other where we get these spreading ridges. And then we have plates that are coming together. Here we've got a subduction plate. Here we have them pulling apart and creating this rift zone. Okay. And we also have, if you look at the Oregon coast, there's the Juan de Fuca plate, which is off the coast of Oregon, and the North American plate. And the Juan de Fuca plate is going under or subducting underneath the North American plate, which is creating our coast range. So these mountains continually build up, and then we get continental crust here and volcanic activity. And that's why we have, 7 non-active volcanoes here within the Portland area. And we also have some pushing up of this lava here in the Cascade Range, creating more active volcanoes. Hopefully this is a bit of a review for everybody from when we covered plate tectonics and volcanic activity. All right, last quick think of the day. The question is, how would you summarize what today's lesson is all about? Seems really easy to just choose one word, but it's actually, I think, pretty difficult to choose one word that embodies the concepts of this lecture because we covered a lot. Luckily for you, you get to explain why that word was chosen. So do your best. And again, quick thinks should be on a separate sheet of paper and will be checked off. Enjoy.